Welcome to the Martin Bailey Photography Podcast. It's December 17, 2018, and this is episode 642. Today we continue our Morocco Travelogue series as we visit the Chawara tanneries, a weaving workshop, and some other cultural delights in the ancient city of Fez. We pick up the trail as we visited the Chawara tanneries, which, as you can see from the first photo for today, is a hive of activity as various companies share the complex of vats in which the workers are processing their leather. For this image, I used my Canon EF 11-24mm lens at 15mm to include as much of the tannery as possible, just to get a more descriptive overview of the place. Because I was looking down on the complex, there is quite a bit of distortion, even after having removed a bit of it with the keystone correction tool in Capture One Pro. My other settings were an aperture of f8 for 125th of a second at ISO 125. f8 is slightly wide for this type of image, but at 15mm, that still gives me plenty of depth of field, so it's fine. As you can see from this and the next image, the tanneries are a hive of activity as the workers all go about their daily tasks. Here we see two of them cleaning up the leather hides that they are processing with rather large knives. I'd switched to my 24-105mm lens for this shot and zoomed right in to 105mm to get as much detail as possible this time. I love the texture and grittiness of this place, and for some reason I'm really attracted to the reflection of a window in the vat close to the top right corner of this image. My settings were f10 for 125th of a second at ISO 1000. I shot this next photograph for a couple of reasons. The first being that it helps us to see the relationship between the men obviously overseeing the workers and the workers themselves. As the tanneries are a conglomerate, I'm sure there are lots of small groups that work together, sharing the facility, but there is a definite hierarchical structure within each group. The other reason I shot this is because I was happy to see so many of the workers wearing waders this year. Maybe it's because it was a little cooler, as this year's tour was a few weeks later than last year's. But if this is a new development, it's great to see. We did still see some people in the dye vats just wearing shorts, like the guy just above the middle of the frame here, and that cannot be good for them. My settings for this photo were once again 105mm at f10 for 125th of a second, and this time with an ISO of 500. Following our theme of visiting local workers and craftsmen, later in the day we visited an old building in which we were able to photograph two weavers making cloth on their looms. It was quite a place to visit, as these people work mainly by the light from a skylight that we'll take a look at in a moment. But with such low light, even at 50th of a second, at f5.6, I had to crank up my ISO to 6400 to get this photograph. Again, I find the grittiness of this environment and the quality of the light very appealing. These looms are powered by a foot pedal, and I found it quite peaceful for the only noise in this workshop to be the sound of man-powered looms rattling away, creating their cloth one line of thread at a time. Here now is what I saw as I looked straight up, having taken a few steps back from where I shot the previous image. To maintain the grey in the cloudy sky, I exposed this so that the sky through the skylight was not overexposed, but that left the rest of the image very dark, So I cranked up the shadow slider in Capture One Pro to its maximum of 100 so that we can see detail in the pillars and what would be the third floor of this rather run-down building that housed the weavers. I found it fascinating that these people were working in this building, and also that there was some kind of vine growing up towards the main light source, which is this hole in the roof. My settings were f5.6 for a 200th of a second shutter speed at ISO 100 with a focal length of 11mm. Of course, visiting all of these locations is possible because I hire an amazing guide in Morocco with lots of contacts, and he knows what we want. I was reminded of this many times on this day in Fez, but one opportunity that really brought this home for me was when he led us down an alley and into a doorway where we saw this man stoking the fire in a furnace that was heating the water of a public bath. With the floor being covered with the wood shavings that the man was feeding the fire with, I'm surprised that this entire building hasn't gone up in smoke, but I guess they've been working this way for centuries, so I'm obviously overthinking things. My settings for this image were f5.6 for 160th of a second at ISO 2000 and a focal length of 41mm. Fire can be quite challenging, but as usual, I just exposed this so that the brightest part of the scene, the fire, was just starting to become overexposed. Then I increased the highlights slider in Capture One Pro to bring the fire back under control, and increased the shadows slider to brighten up the rest of the image, which had fallen a little dark as I exposed for the fire. As my group and I aren't Muslims, we are not allowed inside most of the mosques that we see on our travels, but under our guide's advice there are a few that we were able to photograph from the doorway, and I quite liked this photo, which I was able to time to get a man walking across the end of the corridor. My settings for this photo were f8 at 125th of a second at ISO 6400, so there is a little bit of grain showing up in the shadow areas of this image. I kind of like the striking red carpet though, and the arches, and the warm glow of the light at the end of the corridor. This next image turned out to be one of my favourite shots from the entire trip. Our guide led us down a very narrow alleyway, which at some points was not much wider than shoulder width. My group and I took turns to stand at the end and get a few shots each. I was fortunate that a lady in a red jalaba appeared at the end of the alleyway just long enough for me to add a striking colour contrast to set off the blue and orange colour of the alley walls. I actually liked this so much, I released it as my December desktop wallpaper, and currently have it on my desktop background on my computers. My settings for this were f8 for a 20th of a second at ISO 6400 and a focal length of 24mm. By the nature of touring Morocco in a bus, we inevitably have some pretty substantial drives between our locations, but we generally break these up by stopping for meals at interesting places, among other things. On our way from Fez to Erfoud, we stopped in a small town called Zaida, where I photographed this man with a great characteristic face cooking some vegetable tagines. The tagine is a traditional Moroccan dish and can be found in lots of variations at most restaurants. For this image, I opened up my aperture a little to f5 for a slightly shallow depth of field, and at ISO 100 that gave me a shutter speed of 800th of a second, so you can tell it was a bright sunny day. That's also what's responsible for accentuating the lines on the man's face as the sun shone down on him from high in the sky. Around 2/3 of the way into our drive from Fez to Erfoud, where we would give up our bus for a few days and venture into the Sahara in four-wheel drive vehicles, We stopped to photograph this elderly gentleman tending his sheep and goats. I found it interesting that the mountains and ground we were surrounded by were so arid, and yet there's snow on the mountains in the distance. There's also the unfortunate but inevitable contrast of the somewhat traditional Moroccan architecture to the left and what are probably cell phone towers right next to it. My settings for this photo were f14 for 160th of a second at ISO 200 and a focal length of 78mm. We'll finish here for today, as that was our 10th image, and we'll pick up the trail next week as we head into the Sahara and then continue our journey on to Marrakesh and beyond. Thanks very much for listening today. If you enjoy this podcast, please share a link with your friends. Subscribe in iTunes or your favourite podcast program to ensure uninterrupted delivery. If you have a moment to rate the podcast or leave us a review in iTunes, that helps to keep us relevant in the huge number of podcasts out there now. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter and Google+, etc. And links to everything that I'm up to are at martinbaileyphotography.com, so do drop by and take a look. I'll be back next week with another episode, but in the meantime, you take care and have a great week, whatever you're doing. Bye bye.